The central Andes rise in long, uneven folds along the border between Argentina and Chile. At elevations above 12,000 feet, the mountains lose most signs of life. Vegetation thins and disappears. Rock, snow, and wind dominate the landscape. Weather systems move quickly here, shaped by altitude and geography rather than season. Temperatures remain low year-round, and storms can form without warning. In October 1972, late spring in the southern hemisphere, winter conditions still held the upper elevations. Snowfields covered slopes and valleys. Glaciers filled the depressions between peaks. At this height, sound carries poorly, and distance becomes difficult to judge. The air is thinner, making movement slower and recovery harder. Any sustained effort requires adjustment. Human presence in this part of the Andes was minimal. There were no settlements, no roads, and no regular air traffic corridors visible from the ground. Search and rescue operations in the region depended heavily on clear weather and precise location data. Even then, aircraft could only pass briefly overhead. This environment did not actively threaten those who passed through it. It simply remained indifferent. Survival here depended on preparation, equipment, and timing. Without them, exposure alone could be decisive. On one remote slope, a stretch of snow lay undisturbed, shaped only by wind and gravity. Within days, it would become a fixed point in a survival story defined less by action than by endurance. The aircraft involved was Uruguayan Air Force Flight 571, a Fairchild FH-227D turboprop. On October 12, 1972, it departed from Carrasco International Airport in Montevideo, Uruguay, with a planned destination of Santiago, Chile. The flight carried 40 passengers and 5 crew members. Most of the passengers were members of the Old Christians Club rugby team, an amateur team composed largely of young men in their late teens and early 20s. They were traveling to Chile for a scheduled match. Accompanying them were friends, family members, and supporters, some of whom had no prior experience with air travel over mountainous terrain. The crew consisted of a pilot, co-pilot, and 3 additional flight personnel, all operating under military aviation standards. Commercial jet aircraft typically flew higher and faster routes over the Andes. The Fairchild turboprop, however, required a lower altitude path and careful navigation through mountain passes. At the time, navigation relied on radio beacons and dead reckoning rather than satellite systems. Cloud cover and wind conditions could obscure visual references, increasing the risk of positional error. The flight was scheduled to cross the Andes in stages. After takeoff from Montevideo, it landed overnight in Mendoza, Argentina, due to poor weather conditions in the mountains. The following day, believing the weather had improved sufficiently, the crew resumed the flight toward Santiago. The passengers were not survival specialists. They were students, athletes, and relatives with ordinary backgrounds. Some had basic first aid knowledge. A few had experience with camping or outdoor sports, but none were trained for prolonged exposure at high altitude in winter conditions. Their luggage reflected a short international trip, light clothing, minimal food, and no specialized equipment. The purpose of the journey was routine. There was no sense of risk among the passengers as the aircraft approached the mountains. The Andes were a geographic obstacle, not a destination. For those on board, the flight was simply a means of travel, expected to end within hours at a city airport. This context shaped the events that followed. The group arrived in the mountains without preparation for isolation, without supplies for survival, and without any expectation that they would need to remain there. Shortly after midday on October 13, 1972, Flight 571 entered cloud cover while crossing the Andes. Visibility was limited. The aircraft relied on instrument readings and estimated position to determine when it had passed the mountain range and could begin descending toward Santiago. The co-pilot believed the aircraft had cleared the Andes. Based on this assumption, the crew requested and received permission to descend. In reality, the aircraft was still among the peaks. Strong headwinds had slowed its progress, placing it farther east than estimated. As the plane descended through cloud, the terrain rose abruptly. The crew saw rock and snow moments before impact. There was no time to climb. The right wing struck a ridge, tearing away. Seconds later, the left wing detached. The tail section separated from the fuselage. What remained of the aircraft slid down a steep slope before coming to rest on a glacier at approximately 12,000 feet above sea level. The fuselage broke open at the rear. Seats, luggage, and debris were scattered along the slide path. The force of the crash killed several passengers instantly, including the co-pilot. Others were severely injured. The cockpit was destroyed, and the aircraft's radio equipment was rendered inoperable. The tail section, which contained much of the remaining structure, was lost. Those who survived the initial impact found themselves inside a damaged fuselage resting in snow, surrounded by high peaks on all sides. There was no visible route down the mountains. The temperature dropped quickly as daylight faded. At this point, the possibility of walking out was not yet dismissed, but it was unclear. The survivors had no accurate sense of their location. What was certain was that the aircraft was no longer capable of flight and that communication with the outside world had ended. This was the moment when the situation became irreversible. From this point forward, survival would depend entirely on what could be done with what remained. In the days following the crash, the survivors focused on immediate needs. Injured passengers were moved away from the open rear of the fuselage, where exposure was most severe. Seats were removed and repositioned to create space. Loose insulation and fabric were pulled from the aircraft walls to block drafts. Luggage was gathered from the snow where possible and brought inside. The fuselage became the only shelter available. It offered limited protection from wind and cold, but it was fragile. The opening at the rear allowed snow to drift inside. At night, temperatures dropped well below freezing. Survivors slept close together to conserve heat, arranging themselves in rows along the length of the cabin. Food supplies were minimal. The available items consisted of chocolate bars, wine, a small amount of dried fruit, and a few packets of snacks intended for a short flight. Rations were immediately restricted. Each person received very small portions, often no more than a few bites per day. The wine was used sparingly, sometimes shared in small quantities to provide warmth and calories. Water posed a separate challenge. There was no liquid water available. Snow was collected and melted using metal parts from the aircraft placed in sunlight or held near bodies. This process was slow and inefficient, and dehydration became an ongoing concern. The survivors organized themselves without formal leadership. Tasks emerged based on ability rather than rank. Those with medical knowledge attended to the injured. Others were responsible for collecting snow, maintaining the interior of the fuselage, or retrieving items from outside when weather allowed. Movement outside was dangerous due to altitude, snow depth, and the risk of avalanches. In the early days, several attempts were made to assess the surrounding terrain. Small groups ventured short distances from the wreckage, but visibility was limited, and the slopes were steep. Without proper clothing or equipment, these efforts were brief. The mountains appeared continuous in all directions. A small radio was recovered from the tail section and brought back to the fuselage. After several days of repair attempts, it became operational enough to receive broadcasts. Through the radio, the survivors learned that search aircraft were looking for them. This knowledge affected their behavior. They made efforts to make the fuselage more visible, using fabric and debris to create contrast against the snow. After 8 days, the radio brought different information. The search had been called off. The aircraft was presumed lost with no survivors. This announcement marked a change in the group's understanding of their situation. Rescue was no longer expected. Survival would have to be sustained for an unknown length of time. By this point, the original food supplies were nearly exhausted. Starvation became an immediate reality. The environment offered no plants or animals. Snow and rock extended in all directions. The altitude and cold eliminated any possibility of hunting or foraging. The survivors discussed options within the constraints of their beliefs and circumstances. Over time, they reached the decision to consume the bodies of those who had died in the crash. This decision was not made lightly and followed extended discussion. It was based on the absence of alternatives and the shared understanding that survival required calories and protein. The use of human remains as food was conducted methodically. Portions were cut in small amounts and shared. The practice was governed by rules intended to maintain fairness and respect. The process allowed the group to regain some physical strength, though weight loss continued. Daily routines developed. Mornings were spent melting snow, checking injuries, and redistributing clothing. Daylight hours were used for maintenance and observation of weather conditions. Nights were spent inside the fuselage, tightly packed to retain heat. Sleep was intermittent and often disrupted by cold and discomfort. Mental discipline became as important as physical survival. Survivors focused on short-term goals rather than long-term outcomes. They measured time in days and weeks, marking events rather than dates. Religious practice provided structure for some, while others relied on routine and responsibility to maintain focus. Several weeks after the crash, an avalanche struck the fuselage during the night. Snow filled the interior, burying many of the occupants. 8 people were killed by suffocation. The survivors dug themselves out over several hours, using bare hands and fragments of metal. When daylight returned, the fuselage was partially collapsed and filled with snow. After the avalanche, the group reduced in number and capability. Space inside the fuselage became more constrained. Movement was slower. The loss reinforced the understanding that remaining in place carried its own risks. As physical conditions stabilized for some, discussion turned toward the possibility of leaving the site. The radio no longer functioned reliably. Weather conditions varied, but occasional clear days revealed distant ridgelines. The survivors lacked maps and accurate knowledge of their position, but some believed that lower ground lay to the west. Preparations were gradual. Clothing was layered from available materials. Makeshift footwear was constructed from seat covers and insulation. Food was set aside for a journey, though supplies were limited. Physical conditioning was informal, consisting mainly of short walks outside the fuselage to build tolerance for altitude and exertion. Life inside the fuselage continued during this period. Those who remained maintained routines, repaired damage, and rationed resources. The environment did not change. Snow continued to accumulate and melt in cycles. The mountains remained still. By the time plans to leave became more serious, the survivors had spent weeks adapting to conditions that were never meant to support human life. Their survival was the result of structure, cooperation, and restraint rather than improvisation or force. The decision to attempt escape marked a shift from endurance to action. It was undertaken with limited information and no guarantee of success. What remained behind in the fuselage was a system that had sustained life under extreme constraints, shaped entirely by necessity. As the weeks passed, the physical effects of prolonged exposure became more pronounced. Despite the calories provided by the limited food source, most survivors continued to lose weight. Muscles weakened. Minor injuries healed slowly or not at all. Frostbite affected fingers and toes, reducing dexterity and increasing pain during movement. The cold was constant and unrelenting, especially at night. Psychological strain accumulated alongside physical decline. The confined space, reduced numbers, and awareness of ongoing risk altered group dynamics. Patience shortened. Silence became more common. Time lost its regular structure, measured instead by weather changes, meals, and the condition of the injured. The avalanche had removed any remaining sense of security. Snow buildup inside the fuselage required daily clearing to prevent collapse. Each storm introduced the possibility of another burial. The survivors slept lightly, alert to changes in sound or pressure. Rest was incomplete. Several attempts were made to scout possible routes away from the site. These were limited by weather, fatigue, and uncertainty. Without knowledge of distances or terrain beyond the immediate ridges, each attempt carried the risk of expending energy without result. Some efforts ended after only a few hours due to altitude sickness or worsening conditions. Deaths continued, though not in sudden clusters. Some succumbed to injuries sustained in the crash that never healed properly. Others weakened gradually, their bodies unable to maintain basic function under prolonged stress. Each loss reduced the group's capacity for labor and decision-making. The survivors adapted by simplifying routines. Tasks were consolidated. Movement outside was restricted to essential activities. Food portions were adjusted based on need and role. Those preparing for a potential journey away from the site received slightly larger rations, a decision made with practical intent rather than preference. Morale fluctuated. Periods of relative stability were interrupted by storms, injuries, or further loss. There was no expectation of external rescue. The focus narrowed to immediate survival and the possibility that leaving the site might be the only remaining option. As physical strength slowly returned to a few individuals, attention centered on whether the mountains could be crossed on foot. Observations suggested that the visible peaks were higher and more extensive than initially assumed. The terrain offered no obvious descent. Still, remaining in place appeared increasingly dangerous. By this stage, the survivors had been in the mountains for over 2 months. The environment had not changed. Their situation had. On December 12, 1972, 2 survivors, Nando Paradu and Roberto Canessa, left the crash site with the intention of reaching help. Both were physically stronger than most of the remaining group and had spent weeks preparing for the attempt. They carried small portions of food, improvised from the limited supply, and wore layered clothing assembled from aircraft materials and personal items. Their initial assumption was that the crash site lay near the Chilean side of the Andes and that a descent westward would lead to lower ground. The first days of travel contradicted this belief. The terrain rose steadily, and the peaks ahead were higher than expected. Movement was slow. Snow depth varied, and each step required effort due to altitude and fatigue. At night, temperatures dropped sharply. Without a tent or sleeping bags, they constructed a makeshift shelter by digging into the snow. Rest was minimal. The effects of altitude persisted, causing headaches and shortness of breath. Progress was measured in short distances rather than miles. After several days, they reached a high ridge and saw that the mountains extended far beyond what they had anticipated. This observation forced a reassessment of their situation. Turning back would consume the remaining food without improving the group's prospects. They continued westward. After 10 days of travel, they descended into lower elevations where snow gave way to exposed rock and eventually to signs of vegetation. They encountered a river and followed it downstream. On December 20th, they were seen by a Chilean muleteer across the river. Communication was limited by distance and noise, but the men conveyed their situation using written notes. The information reached Chilean authorities the same day. Rescue operations were organized immediately. Helicopters reached the crash site on December 22. Over 2 days, the remaining survivors were evacuated. There was no announcement at the site, no formal conclusion. The mountains remained unchanged when the helicopters left the glacier. The crash site returned to silence. The fuselage, partially buried, remained where it had come to rest more than 2 months earlier. Snow continued to accumulate and recede with weather patterns. There were no markers visible from a distance. From above, the site blended back into the terrain. The survival of 16 people after 72 days at high altitude was documented and verified through medical examination and official investigation. Their accounts were consistent in broad detail, though some specifics remained uncertain due to memory loss, injury, and the passage of time. The cause of the crash was attributed to navigational error compounded by weather and wind conditions. Public attention focused on the fact of survival and the means by which it was achieved. For the survivors, the experience was not framed in those terms. It was described as a sequence of constraints and decisions made under pressure, shaped by environment rather than intent. There were no claims of heroism. There was no attempt to assign moral authority to what had occurred. The Andes did not present a singular challenge. Cold, altitude, isolation, hunger, and time acted together. None could be separated from the others. Survival depended less on any single decision than on sustained cooperation and restraint over an extended period. In historical context, the event became a reference point in discussions of human endurance, group behavior under stress, and survival ethics. It did not alter aviation practice in a significant way. It did not change the landscape. Its significance remained human rather than technical. What persisted were records, testimonies, and the physical site itself. Over time, snow and weather reduced what was left of the aircraft. The mountains absorbed the remains. At that altitude, there is no conclusion imposed by the environment. Only the continuation of conditions that do not account for those who pass through them.